you so much for having me. So before I get into it, first, I'm actually going to remind everyone that you should be using your phone to tweet as much as you could. And if you need the Wi-Fi, it is embassy_guest, and the password is digitalitaly1. Everything's lowercase. The 1 is a numeral, not spelled out. So we do have a very distinguished panel here today, all of whom are currently or former or State Department employees. I'm just going to go around the table and then I'll just go. So we have Ari Ratner over here, who is currently a fellow at the New America Foundation. Rufus Gifford, who is the U.S. ambassador to Denmark. And then if we move on over here to my left, we have Robert Kelley, who is a professor at American University, and Tom Cochran, who is at the State Department working on platforms. I am going to give everybody a nice softball as we start here. I want to know, who is your favorite actor in digital diplomacy and why? Ari, you want to start us off?
I would say, look, there's a lot of who are my favorites. I was going to say Cute Emergency for a second. You guys know Cute Emergency here. I follow Mideast are horrific, and then they send out beautiful pictures of animals. But then I was like, that's kind of pointless. So, I like the World Wildlife Federation. They have amazing campaigns, both in a lot of airports around the world, but also digitally. Things like you don't need a rhino, or I'm a tiger, not a rug, and I see them go viral a lot, and I see them respond and reply to people. I think one of the key things is being, especially when you're a larger organization, even a larger non-state organization, is being interactive and engaging, not being just a press release online.
Yeah, I mean, I have a few answers, and I think the question that I would answer it this way, which is who's effective. It's not sort of who I necessarily agree with or like, but I have three, because I can never answer the question with just one. I'm in completely different walks of life, though. So I think Huffington Post does a really good job on all as a kind of more traditional form of media. I think they do a really good job on Instagram. I think that they've become very visual, which I think as they've modernized their platforms quite nicely. I think this is a person in the media who actually I find to be infuriating, but uses Twitter very effectively, is Glenn Greenwald. I do think he is very effective on Twitter. I think that if we're going in the celebrity route, because I do think this is actually very important as well, I think Taylor Swift has a handle on social media in a way that you don't see nowadays. She does great videos in a way to engage her fans. Look, that's what this is about. This is about engaging people, and I don't think we should dismiss those sorts of people either.
I have made my selection based on the one that intrigues me the most, and I find it to be irreverent, borderline stupid, but nonetheless provocative, and in that sense effective. So imagine if there is a Twitter handle @United States. I don't even know if there is one, but imagine that there is a Twitter handle called @United States, and the government decided to turn @United States over to any member of the American public for 2 weeks at a time. This is exactly what the government of Sweden does. Every 2 weeks, a new Swede takes a turn with the keys to the Volvo and drives around the world with it for a couple of weeks, whatever they want. Every now and then, you get something which is provocative and a little bit denigrating towards Swedes themselves because of the leadership view. However, I still find it's kind of an experiment at the height of transparent democracy to put the citizens in the driver's seat to direct social media at Sweden. So look it up.
So the one that I wouldn't say the favorite one, but the one that intrigues me the most is a Twitter handle called really virtual. You may remember this from 2011. A guy by the name of Sohaib Athar was live tweeting helicopters over his house in Abbottabad. And he ended up live tweeting the Bin Laden raid. And the reason I find that important is because, and actually this is probably a good segue into our discussion about the power of social media. It's less about that individual and it's more about an individual committing an act of journalism and an individual committing an act of diplomacy in a moment in time using Twitter or using social media. I think this speaks volumes to the power of social media. It speaks volumes to the power of digital. This is why we have things like these giant protests in Hong Kong. This is why we had the Arab Spring. So I don't have really an individual favorite, but I had a moment that was very poignant for me.
So now that we've had a little bit of time to talk about the non-state actors that we think are particularly effective or interesting in this space, I want to broaden it a little bit. What is a non-state actor for you guys in the digital diplomacy state? Is it everyone who's not affiliated with governments? Who are these people or things?
I wonder how I got the seat. Look, I mean, I would say to some extent it's everyone not acting in their official government capacity. So this, it's certainly anyone not in a traditional state mode, right? So, the president tweeting is not, a representative of the state. On the other hand, I think even for people in traditional government roles, I mean, sitting next to an ambassador, right? You see people mix, or Ambassador Mike McFall, someone like, you see people mix official role and non-official role. And to some extent, that's, a divide between their personal and their official, and you see it play out even with individuals, but probably big definition is someone not in the government or someone not acting in an official capacity for a government.
Can I chime in? It's interesting to talk about non-state actors as if there's something novel right now, because it's really the case that non-state actors have been around for a very long time, and in one form or another. We can look back at corporations, city-states, churches, a series of actors, a number of actors that have been around for a very long time, even prior to the Westphalian system, even before that were active in shaping and molding world politics, whatever that was at the moment. So it's highly normative what a non-state actor is, in a sense. One thing that I think has evolved lately is the understanding that non-state actors are not just out there for the public good, right? They're humanitarian organizations, private sector actors that are contributing to growth and prosperity. We tend to think of these as the archetype non-state actor, but we have to consider the fact that if we accept Ari's definition of anyone who is not a state, that organized crime, terrorist organizations, seditious and menacing forces that are out there in the world today are also non-state actors. And how to make sense of them in the diplomatic space is a real question, because they also influence the way politics is conducted and pursued.
I think you have a good point, though, Ari, which is pretty much anybody could be a non-state actor as long as you're not acting in the capacity of working for the state, right? And I think it's something that's really important now because we have social media, because we have digital media, which now puts immense power into the hands of anybody. And that's what's really important. Somebody can tweet something and it can be spread throughout the entire world. It doesn't matter who that person is. They now have the power to reach anybody, anywhere in the world because of the internet and because of social media. We've really gone from a very hierarchical, vertical communications paradigm to a very flattened, networked world.
I know, and I would just say, I agree with everybody. I think, one of the things is, I think to be effective with social media, to be honest, I don't know that I've ever even heard the term non-state actor until I got the invited to this, because I am a state actor, but I suppose I try everything with every power of my being to use social media in a way that is not perceived as being a state actor, because I think when you are perceived as a state actor, you automatically lose credibility in some ways. And I try to I'm very, very active on social media, and I try to engage on social media as a human being, as Rufus Gifford, who is also, of course, espousing the official government position on any given topic, while also potentially, posting pictures of my dog. But both they're real. And so but I think the less you can be sort of labeled a state actor, the more effective you're going to be.
Yeah, can I just add to that real quick? I mean, you're talking about a medium that both by design, but also by culture is inherently non-state, right? It's, the states are late adopters to this. I mean, we didn't have Twitter at the State Department until Hillary Clinton, or in any real meaningful way. And I don't think Hillary joined until after she left the state. So, it's something that is by its nature non-state that states are now playing in.
So I'd actually like to go back to something that Robert mentioned here. So when we're dealing with non-state actors in digital spaces, we are sort of inherently also dealing with people who may have bad intentions, people who are terrorist groups. So like when you're dealing with someone who purports to be like, say, ISIS on Twitter, how do you verify that? How do you determine who actually represents whom in the digital space?
Well, I'll take a stab at this first because I don't know if anybody else is familiar with this report, but a very recent Brookings study has just come out, the ISIS Twitter census. This is being followed by the authors of that study with a book called ISIS, a state of something. I can't remember the exact title, but it's following this report. And the primary investigators in this census went about it in a very labor-intensive, exhaustive way, scouring the Twitterverse, so to speak, for all those accounts which are sympathetic to ISIS, and finding upwards of 46,000 like that they were sure of, possibility of even more. 90,000 is their maximum estimate. They took a sample of about 20,000 accounts and followed them, combed them, of course, because all of that material is in there, with the exception of a few things which might be very useful, like where they're tweeting from, or what their names are, or being able to notice that the accounts are discrete individuals rather than the same individual, because one individual can have multiple accounts, as you know. So they were able to determine that the average number of followers on an ISIS sympathizer account was 1,004. That the average number of tweets per user over the lifetime of their account were 2,219. The language spoken on these accounts, not surprisingly, 73% of the time Arabic, 16% English, 6% French. And a lot of these tweets are coming from the spaces that we would assume, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, but also a lot of accounts from the West. And this is where the recruitment tool of social media is being used by ISIS par excellence. They're able to draw a significant number of people from the West to the cause using this platform.
All right. So sort of continuing this conversation we are now having about ISIS Twitter, how does the use of social media tools or other digital options change how the U.S. is engaging with these kind of groups? State Department folks.
I would defer to you.
I mean, you can tell I'm former state because I'm willing to talk on things that aren't in my lane, and I'm no longer wearing a tie. Look, if you're talking about the threat from digital, I think you have to disaggregate a couple things, right? One is the actual threat in terms of like you can do harm in a digital tool via cyber attack in a way you can't do in writing, per se. So, someone could do physical harm, as the US government did, some government did to the Iranian nuclear program. People can do physical harm, or the Sony attack. So there's that element, but I think what you're getting to is the kind of message awareness and the countering violent extremism aspect, which the US government's paying a lot of attention to, the State Department in particular. And one of the things they're doing, which to some extent I think they're consciously or not consciously, I haven't talked to them, but stealing from what campaigns do, right? You have all these rumors in whatever campaign that, Barack Obama is not a citizen or Mitt Romney is X, and there's a rapid response reaction. And you have the same thing going on now at the State Department with rapid, non-truths. I mean, one of the best ways to respond to blatant falsehoods, which is one of the things ISIS peddles in, or blatant terror, which is one of the things ISIS peddles. Simply the truth. Sometimes the U.S. government is a great responder to that. Oftentimes it's someone else. But the medium itself allows for that, and allows for that openness and exchange, and hopefully allows to lessen the impact.
I would like to establish that I am also not wearing a tie. But speaking into more about how state uses digital tools, I think this one's probably for Tom. Can you talk a little bit about some of the platforms that are currently being used and things that are being developed?
Mm-hmm. So at IIP, our main mission is public diplomacy, and the definition of public diplomacy is connecting directly with foreign audiences around the world, in Ghana, Japan, and France, and Indonesia. We need to do a better job of it, to be honest. The private sector does a much better job of engaging their customers. And we can also think of our customers as being foreign audiences, and the product that we are delivering to them is information about the United States, about American values, about U.S. foreign policy. It's about advancing U.S. foreign policy. We recently launched a new platform called Share America, share.america.gov, which is a socially optimized content delivery platform. Basically, think of it as Upworthy. It's very similar to Upworthy, but for public diplomacy content. There's no need for us to reinvent the wheel. Media industry is doing a great job of creating these wonderful platforms. So it's not necessarily copying the ideas, but it's looking at these best practices and applying these best practices and evolving them in our context in government. Because if you don't acknowledge that public diplomacy or State Department is operating in an information space that is extremely crowded with the likes of New York Times, Vox Media, Mashable, and if we don't have a product that's equal to or greater than the quality of those products, no one's going to read our stuff. So our goal with this platform was to create a platform that was simple, clean, looked like it was something that you would see in regular digital media, but most importantly had policy relevant content that was very easy for people to share into their networks. Because again, the power of the network is getting information to just your supporters, and your supporters speaking on behalf of you, getting it out to second and third rank of individuals. Because I think what Rufus said earlier is extremely valid, which is that state actors are often not listened to as much as I listen to my friends and family on social media. If I see my friends and family tweeting something, I'm more likely to read that and trust that than another organization.
One thing I'll say on the government side is one of the things that I've learned a lot about it, having worked for the U.S. government in comparison to other countries, is that the U.S. gives us a very, very long leash to communicate. And that's a wonderful thing. So in my mind, it's also not, I don't think it's always done effectively. Let's be clear. I don't think that U.S. diplomats ultimately use social media all that effectively. I think we all need to get a lot better at it. But what is exciting, I mean, what's always funny to me is every time I'm at a diplomatic reception and, a new ambassador will have just gotten a mandate from his capital to start tweeting, which is just the stupidest thing in the world, because you can't mandate someone to start tweeting. So of course, like I stand next to a flag with him and take a picture and he tweets it that no one sees. But I think that, you have to sort of build in this culture, which I think, I've just been at a chief of mission conference and down the road for all day today and then tomorrow and Friday. And that the real American investment in trying to modernize the way that we communicate with people from all over the world is inspiring. I tend to believe that it's more about tone and messaging and figuring out how to do it, and not necessarily reinventing the wheel. But I do think it's very, very inspiring what the government's investing in here.
So I'm going to do one more question here real quickly, and then we're going to open it up for folks in the room to ask some things. So everybody get prepped. I expect there to be questions. But we've spent a lot of time talking about how governments are using social media and other tools to talk with non-state actors. But I'd like to go back to a point that Tom made early on, actually, when he was giving me his favorite or most effective non-state actor, which is that it also has really changed the way that people all around the world and other groups can engage with states. To what extent does the way things have developed subvert or flatten the traditional hierarchies that we think of when we talk about diplomacy at large?
I think it's a very simple answer that it has completely flattened it, because there literally is a direct line of communication between anyone on Twitter to any other person on Twitter. I can tweet at the President of the United States. I can tweet at Ashton Kutcher or anybody I want. So it has completely flattened the communication paradigm.
Well, I agree and I disagree, right? You can tweet at them; they don't necessarily tweet back at you, right? So it depends how many. Hopefully to you, but for me, no. I've been trying Ashton for a long time. It's tough, but I would say this in terms of, I think it certainly clearly flattens, though it's kind of peaks and valleys, and depends how many followers you have in nodes and just what takes off. There's a great New York Times article about this woman, Justine Sacco, who had this horrible tweet in Africa, and it was the most tweeted thing. So, even if you don't have followers, you can wake up one day and you have 1 million the next. I would say this from having seen it working inside the government, because I think it's interesting how it changes government culture, because to some extent it mirrors how it's changing the culture at large. NATO has this great concept called the iron middle, describing how organizational change happens at NATO, which is you have people at the top who want to do things very differently, which tend to be at somewhere like State Department ambassadors or the Secretary of State or the Deputy Secretary of State. And then you have the people at the very bottom who always want to do things differently, which tend to be like young people, PMFs, new people from the outside. And those are the people in the government who will tweet back at you, especially the junior ones, right? Or those are the people who really want to change how the US government communicates. And in between, you have this a lot of stasis and a lot of kind of tyranny and no. And it's interesting to see those, one group try and flatten and another group try and keep things vertical. Because the same thing happens at almost every organization you can think of.
Yeah. I think it breaks down the formal lines of communications. Without digital technologies, you would communicate through formal lines of formal channels to the State Department. Now, anybody can tweet Rufus, and anyone can tweet any ambassador. Again, I get back to the Ashton Kutcher model, but let's take it down from Ashton Kutcher down to our ambassadors. It is realistic to think that Rufus would reply to anyone.
Yeah. If we're effective, we do. Right. I mean, that's the point. It's that if we don't reply, then we're not effective.
Right.
Yeah.
30 years ago, you would not have the average Danish citizen call the ambassador and say, "How's it going?" or "Love your dog." Yeah. Great picture.
No, it's really true. I mean, the number of people who reach out to me on social media, and this is how I get invited to things. It's how I get press interviews. It's how, I mean, I could spend this entire hour telling you amazing stories that have come at me from social media because of my accessibility. Now, I will tell you, though, I am the exception with ambassadors, because most of us don't control our own Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, and I would never give up control over that, because it's my voice.
That's something that's improving, because there are model ambassadors that do this. Others see the engagement that you guys get through Twitter or Instagram or whatever it is. This is the new normal. This actually humanizes the principles. This actually makes people realize that the person on the other end of that Twitter handle is not some stodgy bureaucrat that wears a tie. They do wear the tie, but they're actually normal people that will communicate with.
Yeah, I mean, the number of consular questions I get on, "Oh, my son's going to school in Ohio and he needs a visa. What do I do?" So but it's it's good. I think it's good. I think that open line of communication is a healthy thing.
Yeah, but the challenge here is for state institutions to figure out a way to keep pace with the rate of change. And are we always going to be caught in this perpetual cycle where state is trying to keep up with the innovations that are being brought in from the outside? My feeling is inevitably yes, because bureaucracies are just inherently slow-moving things. It takes some forward-thinking individuals within the bureaucracy, like you said, on the top and on the bottom normally, to kind of grease the wheels and get things moving. On the other hand, maybe there is an argument for comparative advantages, that what states really should do is just say, well, in the end, we really aren't going to catch up. We aren't going to win this. We aren't going to surpass. But what we can lend to this is often like authority and legitimacy and responsibility. That's what we can do. If you tweet us and we tweet back and we say something, then we'll stand behind it. And this is not always the case with non-state actors, right? We can doubt the veracity of what non-state actors say, mostly because the mechanism for holding them to account is just not as strong as it is in open democracy. So, is there an argument to be made for comparative advantages of the bureaucracy and the non-state flattened structure to find ways of getting the best out of each other rather than trying to compete? Limited space, really, and limited attention.
So we could talk a lot more about Rufus's dog, but I would love if we could have
He's fantastic, by the way.
So that's our backup plan if no one has
If you go on
questions.
my Instagram, you'll see lots of photos of it.
But who is our first brave audience question asker? I know you are out there. There we go. I believe we have a microphone coming around.
Thank you. My name is Teresa Hitchens, and I work as a senior research scholar at the University of Maryland Center for International Security Studies at Maryland. And I have a two-part question. The first one is going back to the idea of citizen journalists, which I believe you mentioned at the end. This can be a very good thing in situations such as refugee populations, etc. It can also be a very bad thing when false rumors or false statements go viral through a system, and we've seen that happen, for example, in Middle Eastern conflicts before. And how do we counter that? How do we counter the things that are false that go viral from a public diplomacy perspective? That's the first one. And the second thing is, we talked a lot about Twitter, but Twitter isn't the only digital diplomacy. It's not the only social media thing out there. Okay, there's Facebook, there's a whole bunch of other stuff. And I'm wondering how you integrate or cross-platform those who look at public diplomacy. So you can say more in a Facebook post, for example. You can have a longer conversation. Instagram will give you images. That's a different sort of conversation, if you see what I'm saying. So I wondered if those things are also being integrated into digital diplomacy by the government. Thank you.
I'd be happy to answer the second one, and someone else can answer the first one. The answer to that is, you're right, Twitter is not the only thing. Twitter is the thing that is the hot topic that we always talk about in digital diplomacy. But obviously, Facebook, Instagram, I mean, these are all just different tools in your toolbox to communicate with foreign audiences, just like TV is, as is radio, as are print materials. And the most important one actually is in-person conversations. And in fact, I would argue that it's even more important now to have face-to-face engagement with individuals, because it is so, it is an information landscape that is so polluted with noise right now that it's very hard to get through to people. So actually, face-to-face is something that is extremely important.
I'll take the second half too, real quick. Well, I just think the first question really is more an academic question, so I think that it's more appropriate for them to answer. But the second part of the question, and I'll just tell my own personal story with Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. As soon as I arrived at the Post, I wanted to break down the demographics of Denmark, the country I was serving in, to understand sort of who is on what platform. And it becomes really clear that the data is from country to country is actually very, very specific. Twitter is a forum for journalists and politicians, and generally speaking, and people who follow them. This is Denmark specific. I don't know the stats for other countries. Facebook is wide ranging. It's everybody. It's everybody from your grandmother to your niece and everyone in between, and businesses and all that. And Instagram is definitely a youth audience. And so when I thought about all three of those, I actually had to think very, very specifically about how I used each platform differently. So if I'm doing a youth messaging event, I use Instagram exclusively, maybe linking to Facebook, depending on what it is, because I would link my Instagram to Facebook. Twitter, I am self-critical with my Twitter account. I mean, I have lots of followers, but I don't feel like I use it successfully enough. I think, diplomats like to talk really a long time, and the idea of trying to do something at 140 characters is exhausting to me. So I spend more time trying to abbreviate words than tweeting itself. But there are, just one very specific example, and we've been in Denmark. We've gone through a couple of pretty intense incidents in the last month, being one of the most important one being the terrorist attack, the Valentine's Day terrorist attack. And my responsibility after a situation like that is to get a message out from the United States government as quickly and concisely as possible. It doesn't go through kind of a whole, it's not about the State Department spokesman or the NSC or something like that. I felt like Danes needed to hear from me, who they know, about this attack immediately. And Twitter is the way to do that. And it's not about retweeting somebody else. But again, I still feel like you still have to feel it out, I think, and trust your instincts a little bit more.
There are, of course, dangers to getting out in front of stories as well as the Cairo, Benghazi.
Oh yeah. I would never want to get out in front of a story, but I mean, you can tweet sympathy without getting in front of, for victims and stuff. And it's I think there's very, very safe ways that doesn't get ahead of any sort of story.
So it seems as though our two State Department people have decided to abdicate the first question to our other panelists.
The first question was how to counter false information or the dangers.
How to deal with these kind of viral rumors that go that are often quite dangerous, particularly in conflict zones.
Yeah, look, I mean, I would say the first thing someone said before, true about non-psych actors, this is not a new thing, right? Viral, they might be more viral because of social media, or they may spread more quickly. But of course, that's something that's always been part of the landscape and probably will always be part of the landscape. And even in your response, it's careful balancing, because inevitably sometimes you're going to be in front of a story, right? Part of what I think people have to learn within the government, and inevitably will learn, is, well, there's a trade-off, right? I mean, between how authoritatively you respond and how quickly you respond. Ultimately, you want to counter, rumors with the truth, but that's kind of a meaningless answer. I think the reality is, it's you're going to be distrusted. You need people you can trust. There's a whole model you can do, but it's just part of the landscape. And I think it's almost, I don't want to be fatalist about it. It's accepted. You have to engage in the landscape and try and alter it from within, rather than looking at something you can perfectly shape.
Jumping off that, I would say I fully agree. There's nothing out there that says that the proliferation of these platforms is going to open the floodgates for truth, right? And as much as we would love to believe it, what it really does is it opens the floodgates for anyone to participate in the dialogue. And that dialogue is going to get contested, and it's not always as easy as good and bad or black and white actors out there. We have a lot of gray actors, a lot of actors who are white in the eyes of some and black in the eyes of others, good and bad. We deal in ambiguities all the time when we're processing these messages. And I think this is inevitably what comes with the environment.
All right, I think we have our next one here, and then we'll go back there next.
Thank you. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to train a couple cohorts of diplomats at the Foreign Service Institute as they came back from assignment before they went out to another one, on how to use social media to monitor what was happening in the countries where they were assigned, to engage, to really work from the embassy very comprehensively to do that. And the question I have is, so a few years later, what does it look like in an embassy, a U.S. embassy in another country? What's the structure? Who's involved in using social media? What kind of systems have been set up to monitor what people are saying on the popular social media networks of that country? What kind of engagement is going on from we've heard what the ambassadors are doing, but what's going on down lower in the staff across the entire embassy staff?
I'll answer the question briefly from, again, it's just my perspective, and this will be vary from post to post, and I'm at a sort of medium-sized post. So what's happening in Copenhagen would not necessarily be what's happening in other places. I'll tell you what I found when I arrived 18 months ago was very, very little oversight or attention paid to social media whatsoever. There was an embassy Facebook page, there was an embassy Twitter handle, but there was very little kind of interaction with it. And what was out there was sort of regurgitating State Department talking points, which I have forbidden people to do, to be honest. So it's just because it's not particularly, forbidden is too strong a word, but I don't want to do that. That's just not, I feel like we need to put stuff in our own language to communicate with the local audiences. So we've tried very, very hard to modernize this. I actually will point out Medea, who's sitting right there, who's a former Danish intern at the embassy in Copenhagen. And we rely on, you're 22, is that right? Yeah. So, I mean, we actually rely on young people who come in and can help us shape our social media strategy, because so many of the folks who are serving in, who do work in this arena and are responsible for embassy's social media aren't necessarily up on the current trends. And so we do, one of the things I have definitely wanted to prioritize are new young voices who are actually part of the community locally as well, and try to get a sense of what people are doing there and what their communities are doing, what their communities are talking about, and really trying to drive our social media strategy that way. Bigger posts obviously will have more people who are monitoring it. We do have, I mean, I separate entirely my Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter from the embassy's Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. I think that there are things that the government can say that I can't say, and vice versa. I can give a more personal account of any sort of situation, whereas the embassy can give a more government perspective, and I think there's a place for both. So yeah, that's my perspective. That's a thing.
I would add to that I'm relatively new to the State Department. I've only been there a year. But I have traveled and visited a number of posts, and the quality of the social media strategies and campaigns really varies from post to post. And that's one of the things that we at IIP are trying to push, which is better training, better strategies. Not only how do you use social media, but why are you using social media? I don't care if you have 10,000 followers. I mean, are you actually engaging them? I would rather have 1,000 people heavily engaged than 10,000 people just on that list, right? There are a number of posts that I can think of that are doing very well, and the posts that are doing well are posts that have ambassadors that are very forward-leaning and accept the fact that there's risk to using social media. You will make a mistake. It will happen. As long as you have top cover from your ambassador, you're more likely to succeed. The ambassador in Kyiv, Ambassador Pyatt, is very engaged on Twitter himself. He is tweeting people literally as he drives back and forth between events. Ambassador Mull in Warsaw is also, he actually initially was a skeptic, but once he started seeing the value of engaging people directly on Twitter, he's basically a local Twitter celebrity now. He loves it, and he finds it extremely valuable because you can connect directly with, in his case, the people of Poland. So one of the biggest goals of IIP, my bureau at the State Department, is to have a rising tide lifts all boats, to better sort of systematize and train people and teach them the hows and the whys of using social media. We're not there yet. And I don't know if we'll ever be there. I think the goal should always be to strive to improve, right? You're always trying to improve. Once you acknowledge that you're there and you're successful, I think that's the end. You should always be striving to do better. And in this case, you should be striving to do more engagement.
Alrighty. I know that there's first in line, but you're next. Or I think we're good, or sorry, I guess we're gonna go up here first. Apologies.
I'm Joe Slovnik, a Democratic Party activist. I often get requests to post items on my Facebook page from the White House and Organizing for Action and pro-Obama organization. So I have a two-part question. The first question is, do you consider Organizing for Action and the campaigns as non-state actors? Organizing for Action has a mission to only discuss climate change, immigration reform, and a few other issues from the president. And the second question is anybody organizing a tweet campaign or social media to cover the President Obama's visit to Milan and Rome, Italy on March 27th were at the Italian embassy, so I wanted to make sure that I mentioned it. My neighborhood in Chicago was the 43rd Ward, Lincoln Park on the north side, and the 43rd Ward is past Alderman Chuck Bernardini got a special honor from President Napolitano last year. And I got very many LinkedIn inquiries from Chicago Democrats in 2012. So Andrea Peterson released a poll saying that I'm trying to search around employers in Washington, D.C. So March 31st, mostly Democrats. But after that, I'm going to open the gate to try to perhaps move to Chicago and inquire with some Chicago Democrat names. So that's what the two questions are. Hopefully, if you do, please ask me if you don't know much about organizing reaction. But do you consider organizing reaction and campaigns as non-state actors? And the second question, perhaps we could learn from the Danish example you ever see there. Is there a plan for social media attention to President Obama's visit to Milan and Rome, Italy on March 27th this week?
All right, so real quick, I think the question there was, do we consider OFA a non-state actor? And for the State Department folks, does anybody know about any plans about upcoming presidential trips?
I just I don't know if you know what my background is. I worked on both Obama campaigns which is fine. But my point is that I learned so much about what I know about social media from both Obama campaigns and the way you directly engage. But so even though I get all my lessons learned from that experience, which was incredibly interesting and profound, I would consider political organizations, which both are really, in essence, to be state actors. I don't know. I mean, that would be my probably liberal definition of it. I don't know. I mean, I know they're not state actors, but I would argue that they are sort of very closely aligned with state actors. So it's just that would be my opinion. But.
Is there any good coordination alongside the president's trip?
I actually don't. I don't know the answer. I mean,
yes.
There's no. If he's going to Milan, I mean, the White House is in all honesty, if you follow all of the White House forums of social media, they're incredibly effective. I think there will be no shortage of stories and photos that will be driven by them on every form of social media, which I actually love following.
And I know we had a question over here. Two of them, I think, actually.
Okay, right now in Lausanne, the United States is involved in some negotiations involving several countries and no doubt at least a few non-state actors. The question is, where do you see digital diplomacy, social media cutting into that process, and should it?
Did anybody have it?
I mean, look, I mean, first of all, I'm not at the State Department, and even if I was at the State Department, I wouldn't be privy to those. Those were very high-level we're talking about the nuclear negotiations with Iran. So you know, on the one hand, when you rise to the level of something like nuclear talks, right? You know, those tend to be still not carried out in the public view in their most intimate details. On the other hand, clearly they've been intruded on by social media, right? You know, and other forms of media, from the Republican letter to Congress, which was then tweeted to Zarif's response, which was tweeted back to, you know, every way you can imagine. So, you know, it's difficult to answer the question. I think the core of negotiations, I would say this about social media in general, the core of you know, whatever problem you're dealing with, you know, the core of why we had the Arab Spring wasn't social media. We had the Arab Spring because of, you know, economic situation and political situation in the Middle East, and that played into it, right? You know, it might have accelerated. The core of what's going to happen in the Iran nuclear negotiations is what's going to happen in the Iran nuclear negotiations. And that the whirlwind around that is an interesting circus. It's a circus people can play in, they can push on, but fundamentally it's going to be resolved in a room. And some of that, you know, hasn't changed because of digital diplomacy, but maybe I'm wrong.
I can't say exactly what the digital diplomatic role will be on this, but I will say that there is already a public dimension of this, right? And you know, we've seen this most recently with, you know, the congressional effort to try to shift the direction of these negotiations and try to persuade the Iranians from not accepting a quote unquote bad deal. We've seen a presidential or prime ministerial campaign come to the United States and use this as a platform for that as well, and Netanyahu's visit from Israel. And there is not without precedent. We've seen this happen many times over in the Cold War with nuclear negotiations taking some kind of public shape to try to galvanize the positions of the negotiating states and draw support from those polities for one side or the other. So inevitably, it would seem that it would take some kind of form in digital diplomacy, but there most certainly is a public dimension, and there should be.
I believe she had a question. She's been waiting for a while.
Very interesting comments, and what I wanted to ask is, it's very clear that when the ambassador of Denmark is tweeting, it's diplomacy, no matter what. If it's on the private Facebook, it's diplomacy. However, when it's non-state actors, at what point do we differentiate between publicity and diplomacy? So, for example, George Clooney sends a message about human rights. When does that become diplomacy, or when does it remain publicity?
I'll answer really briefly. This is what I say all the time. I think everybody's a diplomat. So I think that if you choose to be a diplomat, you're a diplomat. It's not about your title. So if your message is a diplomatic message, which is trying to communicate with someone across cultures in another country, sharing your message and advocating for what you believe is right and your values, then that's diplomacy. The PR element of it, that would be a specific case by case, but I would be willing to give them the benefit of the doubt and actually typically call it diplomacy.
I think what you're asking, sorry to jump in, is what's authentic and what's not authentic. Because everyone's a diplomat, but everyone's also a publicist, right? The president of the United States is essentially, in the business of being a celebrity also, right? That's how you get votes. That's how, So I think the heart of the question is, what feels real, or what is, for good intentions and not, you want to give people the benefit of the doubt, but to some extent the answer is your own feeling, right? What feels authentic to you? And that's, something that people are going to feel differently about and spar about. But to some extent it's also a false divide because both are inherently involved.
Yeah, involved indeed. And the scholarship on diplomacy and public relations do speak to each other, right? Because they see opportunities to inform and speak to one another. Unfortunately, there are a lot of cases where, we take it on a case-by-case basis, but there are lots of cases where diplomacy tries to implement some sort of PR strategy and it doesn't go well. And I think part of it is because authenticity often conflicts with political expediency, right? So how do you reconcile those things when you're trying to sell an idea, but you also need to stand behind and legitimize an idea?
I know we had a question over here, and we might do one more after that, but I think we're actually starting to run out our clock, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. I wanted to follow up on the Iran question, even though it's very high-level conversations and obviously secret and so forth. But what is being done to engage the Iranian public at large, and/or what you think should be done in that regard?
Who dares speak?
Yeah, I defer. I just don't feel qualified to answer that question specifically. Much of my answer would be speculative. So I don't know if there's more.
From the moment he came, the president has sent multiple messages on Nowruz. He just sent another one on Nowruz. I think there's a tension, and there's been, I just speak to some extent as an analyst, but also having played a little bit of a role. There's to some extent attention. There's always been an effort to reach not just Iran, but any sort of oppositional regime's public. Traditionally this was Voice of America or Radio Marti, or and we had that equivalent in Tehran. But a lot of that is just in the president's addresses through specific words. So calling the Islamic Republic of Iran or not, and some of this played out in the response to the Green Revolution and was quite controversial. But it's clearly part of not only the White House's strategy, but the U.S. government's strategy. And it's clearly in tension to some degree with how you manage very tense negotiations with a very fractious regime with different parts in it.
Yeah, and what I know about this is that my sense is that precedents have shown that getting involved in the national discourse in Iran on anything looks bad for the United States when it is revealed that the United States is behind the message or has driven the message, even when it's not necessarily true. And this was clearly a sensitivity during the Green Revolution to not get involved, to stay out of the way. But if what you're asking is there any sort of pressure coming from the West to try to shape and mold public opinion in Iran on the street, that would seem to me to not be any project of the American government or any other Western government, so as to not scuttle diplomatic negotiations.
All right, well, we are, I think, running out of time. We have time for one or two more questions. All right, one or two more questions. I'm going to go based on when I saw hands go up first, and I know that the gentleman in the far corner there in the brown thing has been waiting for a while.
Hi, Arthur Orkish with the Polish Embassy. I was struck by the reference to Steve Mall, who, for transparency's sake, is a dear friend, and his skepticism to having a Twitter handle before going to Warsaw, I presume, because he's argued with ambassadors abroad, no unintended there, to Denmark by any chance. It helps that he speaks Polish as well, but I've heard horror stories on the other side of that. Is his proactiveness, for example, also results in the fact that if he goes for a bike ride and meets somebody during a bike ride, they start tweeting, and all of a sudden that person shows up unannounced at the embassy because he told them he'll be happy to meet him for a meeting, but his staff doesn't know anything about it. The question that I have is, how do you, maybe if you can make reference to, how do you convert a skeptic who doesn't want to have a Twitter handle at a diplomatic level to actually open one up? We have a handle as an embassy. My ambassador doesn't have a Twitter handle that's, his own. Any best practices that you could offer as far as actually persuading someone who is hesitant, doesn't see value in maybe having that because an embassy already has a Twitter handle, et cetera? I love your perspective as well as the ambassador's perspective on that, and how do you kind of bridge that divide a little bit?
Sure. I think that the way, for most of us here in this room, we just understand why Twitter or social media is important. And often it can actually be frustrating when you tell someone you need to do this or you need to get on XYZ platform and they say, why? I don't understand. So take the frustration away and actually start making your argument with data or information that actually backs it up, instead of saying, why don't you know this? Because that never works. The whole notion actually of data-driven decision-making is something that IIP is really pushing, because historically, State Department and diplomacy writ large is largely a very qualitative field. And it's still pretty qualitative, but there are many things that we can measure, especially now with digital technology. There are a lot of things that we can measure. And because we can measure these things, we can now actually gauge success or failure. And the latter part of that is more important. Gauging failure is really important because nobody admits when they're wrong, or nobody admits when a project has gone poorly. I'm happy to do that because that means that we can move on and do something else that's successful. So back to the case of making an argument for Twitter, or frankly for anything that you're trying to push. You cannot argue against data. Then you're having, that's a whole different logical argument that you're running into, logical problem that you're running into. But if you have numbers that prove that you will be successful, it's a no-brainer that that's a strategy that you should follow. I mean, what do you think?
No, I agree. Listen, I'm a little, I sometimes am cynical about converting skeptics. I will tell you that, because it's I've seen it just go, and the problem is that there's no harm if someone's a bad Twitterer, because they just don't get any response. They have to be prepared for that and comfortable with that concept, and not everybody is. So but I would make the argument, and made it all day today. We were talking about it, that the risks the rewards so outweigh the risks, and in new people. But I also don't think, look, as much as I do think it's important, there's going to be people who are better at other forms of traditional media and will never be comfortable with it, and that's something we also have to accept.
All right, and I know she's been waiting for a little while too. So I think she'll be our last one. See how quickly we go things. Maybe this will be speed around, but.
Hi. So this is not necessarily a question for the U.S. Ambassador to Denmark, because I already know what he's going to say to the questions, but maybe for the rest of you. So we're all talking about how digital diplomacy is actually engaging people, having a conversation with them, not just pushing policy on someone and not just one-way communication. And it's also actually actually responding to things when you get a reaction from someone. So with the Facebook pages that are listed up there for you, the U.S. Department of State, American University, America, how many fans do you have that are not just friends of the organization or U.S.-friendly countries? And when they finally react and they ask a question or they say, oh, we think this is terrible what you said or something, do you then have a strategy for when you respond and when you don't, or do you just never respond to critical questions because that's part of the conversation?
We definitely don't ignore. Absolutely a role. It's really important to not ignore questions. That said, there could be trolls and there could be 7,000 questions that are hateful, and that's where you kind of draw a line. There's no point in answering these questions. To the question, I think you said about how the number of fans and how engaged they are. I don't know the exact statistics, and they actually vary wildly across different platforms and different embassies. It could be anywhere between 5% of an audience to 25% of an audience is highly engaged. And again, back to that point, the number of people that are engaged is way more important than the number of followers that you see that you have on Twitter or Facebook. But so many people still look at the number of followers. That's the measure of success. When that is a vanity statistic, it is completely useless. The statistic that I keep trying to sell is out of that large number, how many people are actually engaged. So I know I didn't answer specifics on how many people are engaged, but it varies wildly. I don't know, maybe for Denmark.
Yeah, no, I mean, and you know my answer to the question. Well, I'll give you another personal example. So the Russian ambassador to Denmark wrote an op-ed. I don't know if you guys know the story. It got a lot of international. He essentially wrote an op-ed on Saturday, essentially saying that if Denmark joins this NATO missile defense program, that it would open Denmark up to ballistic missile attacks from Russia, which is an absurd, an absurd argument to make. And so you take, of course, the foreign minister of Denmark. Yeah, you don't want to make this a U.S. versus Russia thing, of course. So the foreign minister of Denmark obviously condemned the article, and I echoed the Danish foreign minister saying, my own relatively politically correct tweet, which then the responses, mostly in Russian, were very, I would argue would be, I didn't know what they said, but I would imagine they were very, very negative. And I think the point is, there is no point in engaging. This was something that came up in the session we just had, was that you have to look at who is responding to your tweets. Oftentimes, they are state actors masquerading as non-state actors, and they have 3,000 tweets but 0 followers or 4 followers. And you actually have to look at those sorts of things and determine whether or not someone is worthy of a response, or if they are just trying to, needle you, just trying to get a reaction. So I think there's a time to respond and there's a time not to respond, but ultimately it actually goes back to the overall point here, is that you have to trust your instincts on this and be smart. Know when it's going to be continuing to promote your message to engage in the conversation, or when it's actually counterproductive to engage someone who's trying to thwart your message. That's what I would say.
I mean, I would say first of all, good response. And the Canadians at NATO had that great tweet to Russia. This is Russia, and it had Crimea, and this is not Russia. So you can be snarky is one way to respond. I can only answer for myself and from having been in government and not been in government. So I guess somewhat being a state actor and totally not being a state actor now, which is people tweet for all sorts of reasons, right? People aren't tweeting necessarily for digital diplomacy now. I tweet back at everyone who tweets at me, right? Because I have fun with it. It's like my voice. I get to express myself. I'm trying to be a public intellectual or whatever. I'll say anything, that I stand behind, right? Which is totally different than how I would react in government, totally different than how a government official is going to react. And inevitably, government officials are going to engage in a world where most people aren't government officials and don't necessarily have a strategy. So you need to stick with your strategy if you're a government official, but that strategy can change and you have to evaluate. And as long as you're being strategic and you can, have a reason, it might not even be the best reason, but you're thinking it through, you're probably doing something similar. You're probably doing something smart, but everyone else is just kind of out there and making noise for whatever reasons they want to make noise, and that's good. That's the system. And I would just say, I was thinking on your ambassador's question. My previous boss at the State Department had this whole debate about whether he should engage in Twitter, and we decided at the end of the day, he was the Undersecretary for Economics. As long as there was someone who was doing it, that's what mattered. It didn't have to be him. I mean, obviously, if an ambassador or a president, they have a symbolic thing the higher up you go. On the other hand, just the figurehead doesn't have to be the messenger. What matters is that the message gets out somewhere and gets emphasized and really spoken. The person matters, but it's less than the actual message.
I think, and I mentioned this a lot earlier, which was there's the how to get on a platform, but the question that you always have to answer is, why are you getting on? Are you getting on because everyone else is getting on? That's a terrible reason.
Yeah.
You need to know why you're getting on. You need to know how you're going to communicate your message. If you don't have that strategy figured out, then you should probably get better
Be
advisors.
strategic about it.
Yeah.
If you're a government.
All right, well, I think that's all the time that we have. I want to thank our panelists as well as our hosts here for having us. I believe there's a reception. So I encourage us all to go and continue to have this conversation in a face-to-face capacity, as Tom mentioned is so important earlier.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm going to teach many jokes you dogs expense.
Oh, no. Any questions?
Does he have his own account yet? Maybe he wants to put it on Instagram.